The North Atlantic groaned beneath a bruised morning sky as the crippled U-boat lurched upward, pushed not by triumph but by the last exhausted breath trapped in its wounded hull. Salt water cascaded off the conning tower, revealing a vessel more like a ruptured beast than a machine of war. Inside, the air stung of diesel fumes, sweat, and the faint sweetness of leaking battery acid, a poisonous mix that gnawed at the crew's lungs. 27 exhausted men clung to consciousness as the boat climbed toward a surface they had prayed never to see under these circumstances. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, 26 but carrying 10 patrols worth of fatigue in his eyes, steadied himself near the ladder. His torn uniform clung to him like wet parchment, and the fractured gauge panel flickered beside him. They were rising because they had no choice. The bilge pumps had failed after the third explosion. One more hit and they would have been a metal coffin drifting in darkness. Behind him, Matrosenschreider Lucas Hahn, the youngest aboard at 19, fought tears he pretended were seawater. His fingers still shook from the shockwave. Hahn had once spoken boldly of glory and heroism. Now he wished only for air, light, and a sky untouched by smoke. The boat breached the surface with a shudder like a dying gasp. Men stumbled as the deck tilted, alarms blinking red across the control room. The Oberleutnant gave a sharp order to open the hatch. 2 men scrambled up, turning heavy wheels with blistered hands. When fresh air flooded down, cold and sharp, it carried both relief and dread. For surfacing meant exposure, and exposure meant death. The first man on deck froze, gripping the rim of the hatch. Brenner climbed up after him and saw why. A gray silhouette cut through the waves scarcely 2 kilometers away. Sleek, fast, unmistakably American. A destroyer escort, guns already swiveling toward the helpless submarine. The crew had heard stories like these whispered in bunks during stormy nights. Americans did not take U-boat men alive. Propaganda had painted them as merciless executioners. Whether any of it was true no longer mattered. Fear made fiction feel like fact. Brenner's jaw tightened. He forced his voice steady. Prepare scuttling charges. The words dropped like stones. Men hesitated, then obeyed, descending into the cramped steel belly below. Deep inside, torpedo-man Emil Kruger knelt beside a panel of bent metal. He traced its edges, swallowing hard. The charges would destroy the boat and its secrets. Enigma components, codebooks, maps. That was the doctrine. Better to sink than be captured. Yet dying at the push of a switch filled him with a sorrow he had never admitted aloud. He whispered a short prayer, not sure anyone was listening. On deck, Hans stood near the conning tower, shivering in the wind. He could see men moving on the American ship, calm shapes against the pale sky. He imagined their fingers tightening on triggers. He imagined bullets striking the water around him. His knuckles turned white as he clutched the railing. Brenner raised cracked binoculars. Through the damaged lens he saw the destroyer closing, slicing the sea with unwavering intent. A second vessel followed, ensuring no escape. Even if the U-boat tried to dive, the compromised hull would crush them. Every fact pointed toward the same conclusion. He let his gaze pass over his crew. Boys forced into oceans far darker than they had been told. Sons who had learned torpedo procedures before they learned to shave. Men who had seen more shadows than sunlight. None deserved to die here, but war rarely concerned itself with deserving. A burst of static crackled from the bridge's speaker. Then a voice, American, confident, amplified across the water. German submarine. Cease all action and prepare to surrender. You will not be harmed. The claim felt surreal. Hahn frowned in confusion. Kruger froze mid-motion. Even Brenner blinked. But training was heavier than hope. Surrender still meant humiliation, maybe worse. The destroyer continued its deliberate approach, guns locked onto the immobile submarine. The ocean felt unnervingly still, as though holding its breath. Brenner inhaled, the cold air burning his chest. Stand by, he murmured. His crew watched him, waiting for the final command. Before he could speak, a metallic boom echoed from deep within the submarine. The hull groaned violently, the deck lurching beneath their boots. Something critical had shifted, another wound in an already dying vessel. The crew instinctively reached for railings and pipes as the tremor rolled through the submarine. Hahn nearly lost his footing and grabbed the hatch rim, his breath sharp in his throat. Kruger, crouched near the scuttling panel, felt the vibration travel up his spine like a warning. Something inside the pressure hull had given way, and the boat seemed to sag under its own exhaustion. Brenner steadied himself and scanned the deck. The destroyer's bow wave curled outward in white arcs against the gray water. The Americans showed no sign of firing, no muzzle flashes, no smoke, only the steady advance of a ship built for precision. A faint hiss reached Brenner's ears, the slow bleed of trapped air escaping through ruptured seams. Every second afloat felt borrowed. Hahn's eyes darted from the destroyer to the Oberleutnant, searching for certainty. Brenner forced himself to meet the boy's gaze. What he offered wasn't reassurance, but recognition of shared fear. Kruger climbed the ladder and stepped onto the deck with the expression of a man caught between duty and dread. "Charges are ready," he said softly. Brenner nodded, though the words fell heavily. The order he was expected to give would end everything, yet hesitation pressed against him with unexpected strength. Then he noticed something on the American deck. A signal lamp blinking steadily toward them, sending a message he could not yet decipher. And as the light flickered across the waves, Brenner felt a sudden certainty that whatever came next would defy everything he had been taught to believe. That day, the ocean pressed against the hull with a slow, grinding insistence, as if urging the wounded U-boat to accept the inevitable. Every bolt seemed to tremble with each passing second. The signal lamp from the American destroyer continued its steady blink, its white flashes cutting through the mist like a heartbeat out of sync with the dying submarine. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher the pattern, but the shaking of the deck made concentration difficult. The message was simple enough to guess even without translation. They wanted surrender. They promised safety. Yet promises at sea, especially in war, felt thin as salt spray. Below deck, the air thickened with chlorine fumes from the cracked battery cells. Men coughed behind the bulkheads, their voices strained and ragged. Boots thudded unevenly along the narrow passages as sailors hurried to carry out the captain's orders. Kruger, still tense from setting the scuttling charges, passed a hand over his face, feeling the grit of dried sweat and fear. He hated the idea of destroying the vessel that had been both prison and home for so many months, but doctrine weighed more heavily than sentiment. The Enigma rotors, the codebooks, all of them sat just meters away, and each represented a threat if captured. They weren't supposed to think about survival in moments like these. Only duty. Farther back, the chief engineer, Weber, crouched beside a fractured pipe that spat a thin stream of water into the corridor. He pressed a cloth against it, though he knew it made no difference now. His hands shook, and not just from exhaustion. He had served on 2 U-boats before this one, both lost to the abyss with all hands. He alone had missed each patrol due to illness, luck, or fate. He often wondered if the ocean had been waiting for him. Today, he feared, it had finally caught up. Up on deck, Hahn lingered near the railing, scanning the water. The destroyer loomed closer with every surge of the waves. Its guns no longer swiveled. They were locked onto the submarine with unwavering resolve. Hahn imagined the gunners' fingers resting calmly on their triggers, ready to turn the sea red. His breath fogged in the cold air, and he clung to the metal railing as though it could anchor him against fear itself. "Eyes up, Hahn," Brenner said, climbing down from the conning tower. "Steady yourself. There's no dignity in trembling." The words weren't harsh. They were almost gentle, but Hahn felt shame burn through him nonetheless. He straightened, even though his knees still wobbled. From the bridge speaker came another burst of static, followed by a heavily accented German sentence. "Cease all action and surrender peacefully. You will receive humane treatment." The voice carried authority, even reassurance, but Brenner sensed the shift in his men. Hope, faint and dangerous, flickered in their expressions. Hope could cripple discipline faster than despair. "Propaganda," muttered Weber as he climbed up the ladder with a grimace. "They say anything to get us to step into their sights." "That's what they told us," Kruger added, though his voice wavered. Brenner studied his crew. They were exhausted, half poisoned from fumes, and trembling from cold. The sea, the depth charges, the weeks of tension, they had stripped the men down to their most fragile selves. He could see the truth behind their eyes. They wanted to believe the Americans. They wanted to live. And for the first time since their patrol began, Brenner realized he did too. A violent shudder coursed through the submarine. Somewhere below, a bulkhead moaned like an animal in pain. A rush of water swept along the passageway, climbing over boots, filling cracks, pushing upward with the merciless patience of the sea. Hans stumbled, clutching the railing. The deck pitched slightly, enough to remind them that every passing moment reduced their odds of keeping the submarine afloat long enough to scuttle it. "We're taking on more water," Weber said. "A lot more. We won't stay level." His voice held the steady dread of a man who had seen too many metal tombs sink beneath him. Brenner nodded once. "Prepare to abandon ship." Kruger hesitated. "But the charges? They're set. If the sea takes her before the explosives go off, it won't matter. Get the men topside. Move." In the control room, sailors scrambled toward the hatch, their boots slipping on wet steel. Some clutched life jackets, others carried nothing but fear. Han waited at the top, helping each man through as they emerged gasping for air and light. He felt the submarine listing slightly to port, the weight of water shifting inside like a giant, invisible hand pulling them sideways. The ocean wind slapped against their faces as they stepped onto the deck. The destroyer was less than a kilometer away now. The distance felt short enough to touch. Han could make out individual figures on the American ship, sailors wearing thick jackets, helmets gleaming faintly in the overcast light. They did not look monstrous. They looked like men doing their jobs. The signal lamp blinked again. Brenner squinted at it, then exhaled slowly. "They're telling us to abandon ship immediately. They say they won't fire." Weber muttered, "Or they want us in the water and helpless." "Maybe," Brenner replied. "But staying aboard guarantees death. And I refuse to give this sea another crew if I can prevent it." Han swallowed. He had expected the captain to choose scuttling over survival. Hearing Brenner speak of life felt strange, like a forbidden thought spoken aloud. Brenner raised his voice. "All hands, prepare to enter the water. Life jackets secured. Stay together once you're in." The men obeyed with the dazed, mechanical focus of people walking toward a fate they barely understood. Kruger secured the last strap on his vest. Weber muttered a prayer under his breath. Han watched the destroyer, half expecting muzzle flashes to erupt. But none came. The submarine groaned as another internal compartment filled. The deck tilted further, sending a metallic screech into the air. Brenner felt the shift beneath his feet. The vessel no longer fought the sea. It surrendered to it. "Jump!" Brenner ordered. One by one, the sailors plunged into the frigid water. Gasps tore from their throats as the cold stabbed into their chests. Han leapt last, the icy shock wrenching the breath from him. The sea swallowed him whole before he burst back to the surface, sputtering. All around him, heads bobbed like dark buoys. Some men cried out. Others clenched their jaws so tightly blood trickled from their lips. The American destroyer altered course, cutting through the waves with purpose. Han blinked seawater from his eyes as he watched a group of sailors lower lifeboats into the water. They were rowing toward the Germans, not with weapons raised, but with outstretched arms. Kruger stared in disbelief. "They're actually coming to get us," he murmured, voice cracking. Weber said nothing. He simply watched the lifeboats approach, his expression suspended between relief and disbelief. The submarine behind them pitched sharply, its stern lifting as water filled the last compartments. The bow dipped, drawing the vessel downward. Han turned in time to see their ship, worn, battered, loyal in its own way, slip into the sea with a final hiss of bubbles. The ocean swallowed it in seconds, leaving only ripples and pieces of debris drifting on the surface. Brenner felt the loss like a blow. The submarine had carried their hopes, fears, memories of home. Now it was gone, leaving them exposed beneath a gray sky with enemy faces drawing nearer. Yet none of the approaching Americans fired. None shouted threats. They shouted instructions, clear, urgent, life-preserving. As the nearest lifeboat closed the gap, Han saw the face of the sailor at its bow. He was young, perhaps no older than Han himself, and his expression held no hatred. Only concern. "Hang on," the American called out. "We've got you." Brenner stared at the reaching hands, his mind caught between disbelief and the instinct to survive. For the first time, he allowed the possibility that the Americans' promise had not been a trick. The sea had nearly claimed them. The enemy was offering mercy. And as the lifeboat drew close enough for the first German sailor to grasp an American wrist, Brenner realized the most terrifying part. The world he had been taught to fear was not the one he saw before him. The lifeboat rocked gently on the restless water as American sailors reached for the drifting Germans. Han felt a firm grip close around his forearm, strong enough to anchor him yet careful enough not to bruise. The contrast alone unsettled him. He had imagined rough hands, shouts, perhaps the cold press of a rifle barrel. Instead, a young American with freckles across his nose simply said, "Easy, buddy. You're all right. We've got you." Han's chest tightened with something unfamiliar. Not fear, not relief, but confusion at kindness that challenged everything he'd been told. Kruger was pulled aboard next, gasping as warmth hit him like a blow. Blankets were thrown over their shoulders with practiced efficiency. The Americans worked quickly, passing out canteens of hot liquid that smelled faintly of cocoa and burnt metal from the ship's galley. The sweetness caught Kruger off guard, and he blinked rapidly, as if such simple comfort was too bright a light after weeks in darkness. Weber was lifted in with care that bordered on gentleness, a medic easing him down with a reassuring pat on the shoulder. No one barked orders or brandished weapons. Instead, they moved with the kind of quiet urgency reserved for saving lives, not ending them. Brenner climbed aboard last, soaked to the bone, the weight of command still wrapped around him like invisible chains. His eyes swept across the faces around him, both his men and the Americans, searching for deception. But the sailors offered nothing except blankets and steady hands. One of them, a petty officer with a weather-beaten face, handed Brenner a cup of steaming coffee. "Cold out there," he said, as though commenting on a morning breeze rather than a war zone. Brenner took it, holding the cup carefully, almost suspiciously, before letting the warmth seep into his fingers. The simple act felt like a crack in the walls he'd built around himself. The lifeboat reached the destroyer's lowered net, and one by one the Germans were guided up its swaying rungs. The ship towered above them, steel rising like a mountain shaped by war. Yet as Han climbed, he saw no soldiers aiming rifles, only sailors reaching to steady each man, their expressions focused but not hostile. The deck was a flurry of movement, medics laying out blankets, crewmen setting up lines of steam kettles, an officer barking logistical orders rather than threats. Han's teeth chattered violently, but for the first time since the depth charges thundered around them, he felt the tremor might not be fear. Once aboard, the Germans were led toward a section near the bow. The cold metal under their boots vibrated with the rhythm of the engines, steady and reassuring. A medic knelt beside Kruger, checking his pulse, then wrapped him in another blanket. "You boys took quite a beating," he said with a sympathetic chuckle. "Lucky we were close." Kruger stared at him, unable to reconcile the man's tone with everything the Reich had insisted about American cruelty. A beating? The phrase felt insultingly gentle compared to the violence they had endured. Yet the medic spoke with an easy warmth that made Kruger's throat tighten. Weber, shivering uncontrollably, was seated near a heating vent. An American sailor handed him a tin cup. "Drink slow," he advised. The engineer sniffed the contents, coffee again, strong and bitter. He sipped tentatively, expecting the taste of poison, propaganda still hissing in the back of his mind. But it was just coffee. Hot, real, comforting coffee. He let out a shaky exhale. If the Americans meant to kill them, they were doing a remarkably poor job of it. Brenner stood apart for a moment, surveying the scene. His crew huddled under blankets, coughing, shivering, yet alive. He had expected humiliation, perhaps rough handling, chains, or interrogation. Instead, the Americans treated them like men pulled from a burning building rather than enemies pulled from the sea. A lieutenant approached him, offering a towel and a dry coat. "Captain, we'll get your men warm and fed. Doctor will see them soon. You'll be safe here." The ease with which he said "safe" felt almost unbelievable. Brenner studied the man's face, searching for malice, for hidden motives. None appeared. All around them, the destroyer's crew worked with calm purpose. Blankets draped shoulders like capes of unlikely mercy. Han found himself seated beside an American sailor who offered him a package of crackers. "You guys had any real food lately?" he asked with a grin. Han hesitated before accepting, surprised at how his frozen fingers trembled around something so ordinary. The sailor leaned back. "You can relax. War's hell, but we don't make it worse than it has to be." Han swallowed hard. The words sliced through the lies he had been fed, leaving a quiet ache behind. Kruger, warmed by the vent, glanced across the deck and caught Brenner's eye. There was a question there, unspoken, heavy, trembling at the edges. Brenner answered with the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted. The enemy they'd been taught to fear had offered them a gift more disarming than any weapon: humanity. Weber exhaled a long, shaky breath. "Never thought the first warm air I'd feel again would come from an American ship," he murmured, voice thick with disbelief. Kruger managed a weak smile. "Maybe they're not the monsters they told us." Han, listening nearby, felt the words settle heavily. Not monsters. Not savages. Just men, young, tired, and merciful in ways he had never considered possible. As the last of the Germans were wrapped in blankets and tended to, Brenner looked toward the horizon. The submarine that had carried their lives and fears now rested somewhere beneath the waves, lost but strangely less mourned than he expected. Survival had replaced pride. Humanity had replaced propaganda. And the sea, for the moment, was quiet. The lieutenant returned, clipboard in hand. "Once the doctor clears everyone, we'll get you down to the mess. Hot food's already being prepped. You're safe now, Captain." Brenner nodded slowly, letting the words sink in, letting the truth settle into the space where fear had lived for months. But before he could respond, a shout cut across the deck. A lookout pointed toward the north, urgency sharpening his voice. "Sir, contact on the horizon, fast moving." The Americans stiffened. The air shifted. Brenner's heart clenched as he followed their gaze. A new silhouette was rising from the fog. The alarm rippled across the destroyer's deck, cutting through the fragile calm that had settled over the rescued Germans. Brenner lifted his head sharply as the lookout's shout echoed again, followed by frantic whistles from the bridge. The Americans who only moments earlier had been distributing blankets and coffee now moved with decisive precision, snapping into rolls shaped by years of discipline. Their boots struck the steel deck in sharp, unified rhythms. Han felt the energy shift, the air tightening with tension not directed at him but sweeping through him all the same. For the Germans, the sudden urgency felt like stepping back into a nightmare just as they had begun to wake from it. The officers scanned the northern horizon where a smudge of gray brushed the fog. Hank, the freckled American sailor who had pulled Han from the water, narrowed his eyes. "Probably just a stray merchant," he muttered, though his hand hovered close to the railing, as if bracing for a different truth. Han studied the approaching silhouette, fear stirring where exhaustion had only begun to settle. Was it another U-boat? A Luftwaffe scout plane? Or something worse? A threat that might provoke the Americans to turn suspicious eyes toward their new passengers? Brenner moved closer to the rail, his damp coat clinging to his shoulders. He tried to read the expressions of the American officers. One of them, the same lieutenant who had offered him coffee moments earlier, now wore a tight grimace that betrayed no hostility, only concern. Whatever approached, it was not expected. As the fog thinned, the shape sharpened. It wasn't a U-boat, Brenner could tell by the way it cut the waves. Nor was it large enough for a destroyer or cruiser. It skimmed forward like a predator testing boundaries. Weber squinted, his engineering-trained eyes analyzing the motion. "Fast attack craft," he murmured. "Too small for a warship. Too bold to be harmless." Kruger felt the hair rise on his arms. The ocean had become a place of too many surprises, and he no longer trusted any silhouette that rose from its depths. The Americans raised binoculars and exchanged clipped observations. Brenner watched the tension ripple from one officer to another, a silent language of caution. Yet beneath the alarm, none of them looked at the Germans with suspicion or treated them as liabilities. The shift struck Brenner with unexpected force. Only hours ago these men had been enemies. Now they were unexpected witnesses to whatever threat loomed. Minutes stretched, thick and heavy. Finally, the fog peeled back enough to reveal the vessel's true form. A fishing trawler, old and battered, its hull streaked with rust and salt. A collective exhale swept across the deck. Yet the relief was short-lived. Brenner saw the problem before anyone voiced it. The trawler flew no flag. A flagless ship in a war zone was rarely benign. Han's pulse quickened. He had seen similar vessels from a distance during previous patrols. Smugglers, scouts, sometimes disguised supply runners. But the Americans did not immediately raise their guns. They chose caution over aggression, a restraint that again unsettled the Germans with its unexpected mercy. The destroyer signaled with its lamp. The trawler responded slowly, awkwardly, as though each blink had to be forced. Brenner watched the patterns, mentally translating. "They're claiming engine trouble," he said quietly. Hank raised his brows, surprised by Brenner's fluency, but not dismissive. "Engine trouble in the middle of nowhere," he replied. "Convenient." As the trawler drifted closer, the Americans lowered a boarding craft. Han observed the team assembling, armed, but not in a way that suggested panic. Their movements radiated competence, the kind built not on arrogance but on grim experience. He found himself admiring the calm professionalism, a mindset so different from the frantic fear that had thrived in the cramped corridors of the U-boat. Brenner watched the boarding party descend, then turned to his men. "Whatever happens next, stay calm," he said. His voice was deliberate, steady. "Panicking will only make them mistrust us." Kruger nodded, pulling his blanket tighter. Weber exhaled slowly, letting the words anchor him. The boarding craft sliced across the water toward the drifting trawler. Han leaned on the railing, shivering as wind cut through his damp clothes. Minutes passed, long enough for the cold to regain its grip on their bones. The trawler loomed in the distance, its shadow distorting slightly through the churn of seawater and fog. Then, without warning, a bright flash erupted on the trawler's deck. Han jerked back, instinctively ducking. The Americans shouted, scrambling to stations. For a heartbeat, Brenner as the sudden heat blurred his vision. The air inside smelled of broth, oil, and steel, scents that somehow felt safer than any he had known in weeks. The mess buzzed with low conversation. American sailors nudged each other, throwing glances at the Germans that ranged from curiosity to empathy. Kruger accepted a bowl of soup with shaking hands. Weber collapsed onto a bench and let the warmth seep into his bones. Brenner sat last, stiff-backed, still carrying the weight of command even in surrender. The lieutenant from earlier approached their table. He looked tired, but there was a spark of something like amusement in his eyes. "You'll be processed once we reach port," he said. "Until then, eat as much as you want. You're safe here." Weber met his gaze. "You keep saying that," he murmured. "Safe." His voice trembled, not with accusation but with disbelief. The lieutenant leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "War is war. But a drowning man is just a man. We don't choose who we pull out of the water." Brenner studied the officer's expression, the steady sincerity behind his words. Something inside him, something hardened by years of state-fed mistrust, softened just a fraction. As the lieutenant stepped away, Han whispered, "They treat us better than our superiors ever did." Kruger pressed, thought it was an explosion, another barrage, another plunge into chaos. But the flash revealed itself not as fire, but as sunlight glinting off metal. A crate had toppled, scattering debris across the deck. The boarding team steadied themselves, shouting across the gap. A few sailors laughed in nervous relief. For the Germans, every second felt like teetering on a knife's edge. The boarding party returned 20 minutes later, towing a small wooden box. Hank leaned toward Han. "Probably contraband," he whispered. "These waters attract smugglers. War makes people do strange business." Han nodded, though the idea of a harmless trawler causing so much alarm felt strangely grounding, an ordinary worry in a world defined by extraordinary violence. The box was carried past the Germans toward the bridge. Brenner's eyes lingered on it. The U-boat commander inside him, dormant but not dead, felt a pull of professional curiosity. Codebooks? Maps? Stolen signals equipment? But the Americans protected it closely, revealing nothing. Once the trawler drifted off under tow, the tension on deck dissolved. Blankets were redistributed. Warm drinks reappeared. The Germans were shepherded toward the mess hall, not with suspicion but with weary kindness. Han stepped into the warmth of the interior, blinking as the sudden heat blurred his vision. The air inside smelled of broth, oil, and steel, scents that somehow felt through the room, listening to their laughter, their sighs, their human weariness. Hours later, while the Germans rested, Brenner stepped onto the deck alone. The sea spread before him like a vast sheet of shifting steel. Behind him, the destroyer hummed with steady engines and murmured voices. He looked toward the horizon where the trawler had been towed, now a distant speck. A sudden clatter behind him made him turn. It was Hank, carrying a stack of folded jackets. "You left yours in the mess," he said with a smile. Brenner accepted it silently. Hank hesitated, then added, "That box we pulled, it wasn't smuggled goods. It was a message canister. Someone tried to hide it." Brenner stiffened. "A message?" Hank nodded. "Encrypted. The captain thinks it came from a German source, and he thinks it might mention your boat. The ocean wind froze around Brenner as the implications settled like ice in his veins. The secret they had believed sunk with their submarine might not have stayed buried after all.